Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. I'd like to welcome you, dear viewers, to another in our series, The Forces of Evil. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah's peace and blessings be on each and every one of you. In this segment of our program, we continue to look at the second method by which the satanic forces creates confusion and corruption in the world. It does corruption, desires, and sin. That these things which are naturally evil, which we should know to be evil, are made to seem appealing to us. We spoke about the role of the media in this, in promoting corruption in the society. And how things which the disbelievers have taken now to be a norm, these things are now appearing attractive to the believers themselves because of the media promoting them as good. And of course for the disbelievers, it's very difficult to convince them that such and such a thing is not good, because these things are brought into the society through human desires. The satanic forces will play and work on desires, because when the desires become attached to something, a person becomes addicted to that thing. Very, very difficult to break them free. If they're attached to it because of ignorance, this was a practice they were doing, but they were not aware, and then you give them the knowledge, that easily cures that problem. However, when people are linked to something on the basis of that emotion, that desire, it's locked in on it, then it's very, very difficult to handle. And we spoke of alcohol as being the major facilitator of that. We spoke about the media, we spoke about now of alcohol, how alcohol lowers human inhibitions and then makes sinful things appear appealing, attractive, etc. Now, the second area related to this is that of sexual deviation. Sexual deviation. That males and females, and usually when you hear the text, they refer mainly to the males, etc., because much of the deviation comes through their channel. The women tend to follow. So, men are often addressed. For example, Prophet ﷺ had said, "Ittaqun nisa, fa inna awwala fitnatin, awwal fitnat bani Israel kanat fi nisa." That is, beware of women, for indeed the first trial or temptation of the children of Israel came through women. Now, from the Islamic perspective, it's not the matter that woman is the great temptress. She is the evil one. She is the one who got Adam to eat from the apple, and then they fell from the Garden of Eden. This is not the Islamic belief. Adam and Eve were jointly responsible. Adam even more so than Eve. He was the head of their family. And Allah forgave them. So it's not an evil which has been put on women, and now women are carrying this evil down through the centuries. But Allah warns us through His Prophet to beware of women, in the sense that, there are guidelines which Islam has set for women. If we allow women to go beyond these guidelines, then they become a trial, a danger to human society, because men are naturally attracted to women, And Prophet ﷺ, in a narration found in Sunan al-Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah, he said, "I didn't leave behind a trial more severe on men than women." This is a major trial facing Muslims and non-Muslims also alike. As I said, it's not because women are inherently evil or anything, but because of the fact that if men and women don't stay within the bounds which have been set by God, then it leads to corruption in the society. This is why Islam has women covering themselves. It separates men from women in so many walks of life. They're separated. There's this separation between the sexes. Women are covered to protect them, to let themselves be known in the society. All of that there to protect the women, and at the same time also to protect the society from the harm which comes from women coming under attack by males in the society. So Islam encourages to avoid sexual deviation in the society by all means, whether it means also the issue of the dowries. The dowries themselves can become an issue of temptation and sexual deviation, wherein, unfortunately, you find Muslims, dowry is normally given by the male to the female, symbolic of his preparedness to look after that female. However, as wealth came into societies more, you had elements that promoted the idea of huge dowries that was according to their status, etc., etc. And this became very popular, especially with the coming of oil into the Gulf and these kind of things. And what that led to is that men could not marry early anymore. The cost of getting married became very, very exorbitant. People have to be, saving and saving and saving, and the wedding reception and then preparing a home, and all of these things became so complicated that men started to get married much later in their 30s and this type of things. But what was the consequence? What was the consequence? The consequence is that if men don't get married at the time in their late teens, early 20s, etc., this is the time when their hormones are the strongest. They're driven the greatest. So if they don't get married at that time, then these desires are going to manifest themselves through other channels. And what you find, unfortunately, in certain parts of the Middle East, etc., is that there's a prominence, of homosexual activity amongst males. I mean, it may not be the type of homosexual activity which, is common in certain other societies where it is a chosen way of life, where people actually choose that way of life. But it is a situation where people, have these desires and there's no way to fulfill it. So, these elements become available, and people end up in homosexual activity, for temporary periods of time. When they get married or when they're able to have means, etc. Outside of that, then they get married and they leave that behind them. But still, there's that period of homosexual activity, and you can find it in schools and these type of things. Very, very dangerous. You also find it with workers. Workers who, are not able to bring their families, unfortunately. They're not able to bring their families, because of certain legal restrictions, etc., which, don't allow them to bring their families here with them. So you have these massive groups of males working, and then with no opportunity to, again, bring their wives, etc., or get married, etc., you find these men, some of these men will be engaged in certain kind of homosexual activities. Or it could be, going to prostitutes or prostitution developing, etc., etc. These are among those elements. So we have issues of dowry, we have workers. We also find in prisons, where Muslims or people get stuck in prisons, and because they don't have access to women again, there's that tendency for corruption to arise, in this area. So on one hand, women should be available for marriage easily to prevent another element of corruption coming about. But on the other hand, they should not be so accessible as to promote, acts of fornication, adultery, etc., etc., mistresses and all those kind of things. But what we find is that, in general, there's a tendency to promote women in the media. Woman has become like a sex object to sell products. The issues of beauty contests, where women are lining up, exposing themselves, going through different, physical things in bathing suits and all the kind of things that they're doing. All of this is really dishonoring the woman, or she's, displayed in this fashion. But of course, it's supposed to be glamorous. It's made to seem glamorous, very attractive. The woman, she gets a crown and maybe a lot of money and travels around the world and influence and all these kind of things. But it's corruption. It is evil. And it promotes further corruption in the society. Also we can find, other elements of this corruption coming through the nudist beaches and nudist colonies, issues of bathing naked, which is common practice in the West, where, for example, students in schools, when they play gym, they have PE, whatever. When the time comes to bathe, they're put into these rooms with just shower heads on the walls. So people have to go in there and all bathe naked. This is also exposing people to corruption. This is sexual deviation. It's not necessarily male-female, but it's male-male. Men are exposing themselves, and this is supposed to be natural. They're promoting this idea that to be shy about oneself, etc., it's considered to be some kind of psychological problem. And the basic idea that the West promotes is, if you have it, flaunt it. You got the stuff, then you should be proud of it, show it off. This kind of thing. Whereas this is totally against Islamic teachings. Private parts of the body are to be covered. They're kept from the view of the public. Because exposing body parts becomes a corruptive influence in the society, without a doubt. So Islam opposes at all levels, anything which would promote different aspects of sexual deviation in the society, whether it's through the media, whether it's through things like beauty contests, things like nudist colonies, beaches, this type of things. Islam does try to separate the sexes, males from females, but at the same time it does encourage early marriage, discourages the late marriages, which tend to produce circumstances for corruption, where males unable to have access to females, in confined areas or in limited places, etc., you'll find them, getting involved in, corrupt homosexual type activities. And we also talked about, special areas like in prisons, etc. It becomes very, very important that those in positions of authority, etc., be aware, to protect this population, even people in prison, from the harm which may come from it. And coeducation, where males and females are studying together. This is something which has been strongly promoted in the West, the idea of separating girls studying separately, males studying separately. This is something not good, it's not healthy, it's not educationally sound. But the fact of the matter is that, experiments which have been done in all-girl classes, etc., show that girls' performances increase rapidly over mixed classes. And that's the same in the case of males, where their teachers are males. Because, of course, they've done some experiments where they separate the males out, but they give them female teachers. And, of course, again, this is going to affect the productivity of that class, where young males tend to respond more readily to male teachers, where female teachers are not able to motivate them and to move them and for them to respond to them in the way that males do. So their productivity may not seem to gain that much, or it may not even seem to gain at all. Maybe they might even seem to go backwards. But where male children are separated out and given male teachers, then you find that there is an increase in their productivity. They do become better students, etc. So even in such a primary area as separate education, co-education, instead of co-education or single-sex education, see, Islam tries to protect the society from those the harm which comes from the mixed education, etc. And that harm may be to the individual, where he goes to class. The males, usually tends to happen more so with the males, they're distracted by the females in the class. So instead of focusing on one's work, etc., he's focusing on somebody who would like to be, would like to have some relationship with, some girlfriend, or etc. These type of things. This is promoted, and this is definitely something harmful. So the second area, the area of sexual deviation, is an area which satanic forces create confusion in the society. Splits up families. Families are split up because of extramarital affairs and these kind of things. Also, where people get locked into deviant practices like homosexuality. This is why Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had said, teach your children salah by the time they're 7 and spank them for it by the time they get to be 10, and separate them in their beds. Most people think it's just separating the males from the females, but it's separating both the males from the males and the females from the females. They should not sleep together in the same beds. Why? Because corrupt activity may take place there and the child finds some pleasure in it, etc., and they're now turned towards it. And of course, once they go into school or circumstances outside of school where they come in contact with adults or whoever, that reinforces these kind of feelings, these practices, etc., then we have the makings of corrupt individuals, whether they're homosexuals or heterosexuals. Now, the third major area of beautification of sins and desires is the area of music and singing. And that area, inshallah, we'll cover in our next program. It is a wide enough topic that in order to give it its due and full justice, we'll save until our coming program. But suffice to say in this program that we have focused on sexual deviation as the second major area, the area following drinking alcohol or intoxicants. And we could also add to the issue of sexual deviation that much of the deviant behavior becomes facilitated by the taking of alcohol. So they're sort of interrelated. You can't really separate them out. That much of the sexual deviation which takes place in society, is where people are under the influence of intoxicants, one way or another. So with that, dear viewers, I'd like to thank you for being with us in this segment of our program, The Forces of Evil. The program in which we have been looking into evil historically, from the time of the creation of the first man and the forces of evil that came along with him, Satan and those who followed him from among the world of the jinn. This has been a historic struggle, a struggle which has been going on through our lives from the earliest of times. And Allah warns us that we should realize that Satan is a clear and open enemy to us, and we must take him as that kind of an enemy. If we don't take the forces of evil really as seriously as serious enemies, then we will be easily succumb. We'll easily succumb to them. We'll easily be overcome by them. So when we talk about forces of evil, we're talking about it warning ourselves and yourselves, dear viewers, about the harm that can come through the forces, the satanic forces in our world. Whether it's the confusion which leads to people to deny God's existence or to worship other gods besides God, or even in their own worship it becomes difficult for them to do it because, they become so doubtful about it, or, it comes through the point of alcohol and corruption, drugs, whether it's cocaine or crack, and, every year, every 2 years, every 5 years, new elements of drugs are brought into the society, which further destroy families, minds, human beings, human beings whose purpose here is to worship God, not to worship their own desires, or to take their desires as their gods, as Allah speaks about in Surah Al-Jathiyah, the 26th chapter. أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَنْ أَعْلَى عِلْمٍ. Have you not seen the one who has taken as his Lord or as his God his own desires, and Allah sent him astray even with the knowledge that he had? So, dear viewers, we'd like to thank you for being with us in this segment. As I said, we hope that you continue to watch the coming segments, and you may contact me if you'd like to give any comments or would like to share any thoughts on this subject or others. You may contact me at my webpage, bilalphillips.com. That's BILALPHILIPS, one word, .com. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.